October 25th, 1944. Samar Island, Philippines. Lieutenant Commander Ernest E. Evans stood on the bridge of the USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer never designed to face capital ships. Dawn broke across the Philippine Sea, revealing a sight that would have paralyzed lesser men. 4 Japanese battleships, 8 cruisers, 11 destroyers. The most powerful surface fleet Japan had assembled since Pearl Harbor was bearing down on the unprotected American landing forces at Leyte Gulf. Between this armada and thousands of vulnerable American soldiers stood only Taffy 3, a small escort carrier group with its handful of lightweight destroyers and destroyer escorts. Evans didn't hesitate. He turned to his crew and spoke words that would echo through naval history. A large Japanese fleet has been contacted. They are 15 miles away and headed in our direction. They are believed to have 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and a number of destroyers. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds, and there is no running away from it. We will do what damage we can. Then, without waiting for orders, Evans did the unthinkable. He turned his tiny 2,700-ton destroyer toward the 70,000-ton Japanese battleship Armada and charged at flank speed. What followed would become one of the most improbable naval battles in history. The mathematics of combat dictated annihilation. The Japanese Yamato-class battleships alone displaced more than 25 times the Johnston's weight. Their 18.1-inch guns fired shells weighing as much as a small automobile. A single hit could, and eventually would, tear the Johnston apart. But naval battles aren't always decided by tonnage and firepower alone. Sometimes they're decided by courage so profound it borders on madness. This is the story of how a single American destroyer, alongside a handful of small ships, charged into the jaws of death and changed the course of the Pacific War through sheer, unrelenting audacity. The Johnston sliced through the Philippine Sea at 30 knots, its bow throwing spray as Evans ordered all hands to general quarters. The klaxon's wail echoed through narrow passageways as men scrambled to battle stations. In the Fire Control Center, Lieutenant Robert C. Hagan processed information with cold precision. Range, 20,000 yards. Target, the lead heavy cruiser. The odds were beyond comprehension. The Fletcher-class destroyer carried 5 5-inch guns, 10 torpedo tubes, and anti-aircraft weapons. Against it came the Japanese center force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, a fleet including the super battleship Yamato with 9 18.1-inch guns, each capable of hurling 3,200-pound shells over 25 miles. Alongside it sailed the battleships Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, each a floating fortress of steel and fury. At 7:00 a.m., the Johnston opened fire at extreme range. The first salvo fell short, the second overshot. The third struck the superstructure of the heavy cruiser Kumano. "We're hitting the bastards," someone shouted over the communication circuit. But Japanese shells were already in the air. The math was brutally simple. The Johnston could fire shells weighing 55 pounds. The Japanese battleships fired shells weighing 3,200 pounds. The difference wasn't just arithmetic. It was existential. At 7:07, a 14-inch shell from the battleship Kongo struck the Johnston. The explosion tore through the destroyer's engine room, killing dozens instantly. Power failed to the aft gun mounts. The ship slowed to 17 knots. Fires erupted across the deck. By any rational calculation, the Johnston should have withdrawn. Instead, Evans ordered the ship closer. "We're making a torpedo run," he announced, his voice steady despite the carnage around him. The Johnston charged to within 10,000 yards of the Japanese cruisers. Point-blank range for naval combat. In the torpedo room, sailors worked with mechanical precision. The Johnston launched all 10 of its torpedoes in a perfect spread. Through his binoculars, Evans watched as one torpedo struck the cruiser Kumano, blowing off her bow. The 13,000-ton cruiser lurched out of formation, crippled. The Japanese response was immediate and overwhelming. Every ship in range concentrated fire on the impudent American destroyer. Shells fell like rain. The sea around the Johnston boiled with near misses. On the bridge, Evans remained standing despite shrapnel wounds to his face, hands, and legs. Blood soaked his uniform, but he refused to relinquish command. "I'll never abandon ship as long as a gun will fire," he told his executive officer. The Johnston's audacity had accomplished something remarkable. The entire Japanese center force had been thrown into confusion. Kurita, believing he was under attack by a much larger American force, ordered his ships to turn away temporarily. The delay would prove critical. Aboard the escort carrier USS Fanshawe Bay, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague watched in disbelief as the Johnston charged the Japanese fleet. Sprague commanded Taffy 3, a unit never designed for surface combat. His 6 escort carriers carried aircraft intended for ground support, not fleet battles. His 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts were screening vessels, not capital ships. "Small boys attack," Sprague ordered over the radio, committing his remaining destroyers to follow Evans' lead. The USS Hoel, USS Heermann, and the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts joined the Johnston in what naval historians would later call the last stand of the tin can sailors. These small ships, collectively displacing less than a single Japanese battleship, charged into the teeth of the most powerful surface fleet Japan had deployed since the war began. The mathematics of the battle defied comprehension. Taffy 3's ships carried a combined total of 25 5-inch guns. Against them, the Japanese center force brought 18 18.1-inch guns, 16 16-inch guns, 21 14-inch guns, and over 100 8-inch and 5-inch weapons. On paper, the battle should have lasted minutes. Instead, it stretched into hours. The Johnston, despite catastrophic damage, turned back toward the Japanese fleet after its initial torpedo run. With only 2 functioning gun mounts, Evans maneuvered his crippled ship between the Japanese cruisers and the vulnerable American escort carriers. On the bridge, Navigation Officer Lieutenant Jesse Cochran plotted intercept courses with blood-smeared charts. The ship's interior was a vision of hell. Compartments flooded, electrical fires burning, wounded men screaming in passageways. Still, the remaining guns fired with metronome precision. At 8:20, the Johnston engaged a squadron of Japanese destroyers that threatened the American carriers. Despite being outnumbered and severely damaged, Evans placed his vessel between the enemy and the carriers. The Johnston's remaining guns fired so rapidly, they began to overheat, their barrels glowing dull red in the morning light. "We're fighting them with one hand and the ocean with the other," radio man Bob Billy reported as damage control parties fought to keep the ship afloat. Water poured through shell holes below the waterline. Counter-flooding tanks to maintain stability meant deliberately taking on more water, a desperate gamble that bought time measured in minutes. The Japanese destroyer Yukikaze, itself a veteran of numerous battles, approached to deliver a killing blow. The Johnston, operating on emergency power with just one functional gun, scored 3 direct hits on the attacking destroyer. The Yukikaze veered away, seeking easier prey. In the CIC, Lieutenant Hagen maintained fire control despite the ship's failing systems. "Manual targeting only," he ordered as electrical systems failed. Gun crews resorted to muscle power, cranking turrets by hand to track targets. At 9:10, the Johnston found itself surrounded by Japanese warships. The battleship Congo, 4 cruisers, and at least 3 destroyers concentrated their fire on Evans's ship. The math was final and absolute. No vessel could withstand such punishment. A salvo from the cruiser Yahagi struck the Johnston's bridge, killing several men instantly. Evans, already wounded multiple times, was thrown against a bulkhead but remained conscious. "Keep firing," he ordered, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of battle. By 9:30, the Johnston had expended all its ammunition. Gun crews fired star shells, smoke shells, even empty powder casings in defiance. The ship listed 30 degrees to port, dead in the water. Fires burned uncontrolled across its decks. At 9:45, Evans gave the order to abandon ship. The Johnston had been in continuous combat for 2 hours and 45 minutes against overwhelming odds. Of its crew of 3 down 27 men, only 141 would survive. As the ship slipped beneath the waves, survivors reported a moment that transcended the brutality of war. Japanese destroyer captains, recognizing the extraordinary courage they had witnessed, stood at attention on their bridges and saluted as the Johnston went down. Ernest Evans went down with his ship. He would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American in the U.S. Navy to receive this distinction. His citation would read simply, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." The Johnston's sacrifice was not in vain. The audacious attack by Taffy III's small ships had thrown Admiral Kurita's force into confusion. Japanese lookouts, expecting to encounter a token screening force, instead found themselves under attack from multiple directions. American aircraft from the escort carriers, though armed with depth charges and light bombs rather than anti-ship weapons, conducted continuous harassment attacks. The Japanese commanders, trained in the methodical naval doctrine of decisive battle, found themselves confronting an enemy that refused to follow the mathematics of naval combat. American destroyers charged when they should have fled. Aircraft attacked with weapons unsuited for the task. Escort carriers turned toward the enemy rather than away. Admiral Kurita, believing he faced a portion of the American Third Fleet with its fast battleships and fleet carriers, ordered a fateful turnaway at 9:11 a.m., just as victory was within his grasp. With the landing forces at Leyte Gulf virtually unprotected, Kurita withdrew. The mathematics of battle had been overturned by the calculus of courage. December 1944, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood before assembled naval officers, preparing to deliver a speech about the battle off Samar. The statistics of the engagement remained incomprehensible even weeks later. 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts had turned back 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. In no engagement in its entire history, Nimitz began, has the United States Navy shown more gallantry, guts, and gumption than in the 4 hours between 07:30 and 11:30 of October 25, 1944. The tactical victory had been purchased at terrible cost. The destroyers Johnston, Howell, and the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts had been sunk. The escort carrier Gambier Bay became the only American aircraft carrier sunk by surface gunfire during the war. Over 1,000 American sailors had died, but the strategic victory was undeniable. The Japanese center force had withdrawn. The landing forces at Leyte Gulf remained secure. The American reconquest of the Philippines continued unabated. The Imperial Japanese Navy, after this final sortie, ceased to be an effective fighting force for the remainder of the war. In the officers' club later that evening, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague sat with Commander W.D. Thomas. one of the few surviving officers from the Johnston. They reviewed the battle reports, still struggling to comprehend how their small force had prevailed. The Japanese had everything going for them, Thomas said, nursing a whiskey. Surprise, firepower, tactical position. By every calculation, we should have been annihilated. Sprague nodded slowly. Naval battles aren't just about tonnage and gun caliber. Sometimes they're about the incalculable. Sir? Courage, Commander. The kind Evans showed when he charged those battleships. Sprague stared into his glass. The Japanese understood naval warfare as a science. We showed them it's also an art. The battle's impact extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. In Tokyo, the Imperial Japanese Navy High Command received Kurita's report with stunned disbelief. The center force had expended precious fuel reserves, already critically short in Japan, only to withdraw at the moment of potential victory. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, demanded explanations. How had Japan's most powerful surface fleet been turned back by a handful of escort carriers and destroyers? The answer challenged fundamental assumptions about modern naval warfare. The American destroyers had demonstrated that offensive action, even against overwhelming odds, could disrupt enemy operations far out of proportion to the attacking force's size. This lesson would influence naval doctrine for decades to come. More immediately, the battle accelerated Japan's shift toward desperate measures. With conventional naval forces proving ineffective, emphasis increased on kamikaze attacks and other suicide tactics. The mathematics of attrition had turned irrevocably against Japan. January 1945. Ulithi Atoll. Lieutenant Robert Hagen, one of the Johnston's surviving officers, sat aboard the transport ship taking him back to the United States. He wrote in his journal, documenting memories still painfully fresh. The numbers never made sense. Our 5-inch guns against their 18-inch monsters. Our 2,700 tons against their 70,000. By every calculation, we should have broken and run. But Evans understood something beyond mathematics. He understood that sometimes the mere act of fighting changes the equation. Hagen paused, pen hovering over paper. Around him, other survivors of Taffy 3 slept or stared silently at the horizon. Men who had witnessed the impossible and lived to tell of it. I've tried to calculate our chances that morning, he continued writing. 0%? 1%? Does it matter? Evans didn't see probabilities. He saw duty. And in seeing only duty, he achieved the impossible. The USS Johnston's charge against the Japanese center force would enter naval legend, studied by generations of officers at Annapolis and naval academies worldwide. The battle demonstrated eternal truths about warfare that transcended technology and tactics. In 1945, as American forces closed on Japan, naval planners incorporated lessons from Taffy 3's stand. Aggressive action, even with inferior forces, could disrupt enemy operations far beyond mathematical expectations. The psychological impact of unexpected resistance could paralyze even experienced commanders. Admiral Raymond Spruance, addressing Naval Academy midshipmen in 1946, summarized the lesson. When you're stronger than the enemy, you can afford to be cautious. When you're weaker, sometimes audacity is your only advantage. October 25th, 1994. USS Midway Museum, San Diego. 50 years to the day after the battle off Samar, survivors gathered for perhaps their final reunion. Old men now, they stood where young men had once fought. Bob Billy, formerly a radio man on the Johnston, addressed assembled naval officers and history students. "People ask how we did it," he said, his voice wavering with age, but not with doubt. How did we charge those battleships? The answer is simple. We never calculated the odds. Evans never gave us time to be afraid. He paused, looking out at the young faces watching him. Naval battles aren't won by the ship with the biggest guns. They're won by the crew with the most courage. That morning, we had Evans. And Evans had more courage than any Japanese battleship had armor. The discovery of the Johnston's wreck in 2019, lying 21,180 feet beneath the Philippine Sea, brought renewed attention to this extraordinary battle. Remotely operated vehicles captured images of the destroyer's hull, still showing the massive damage inflicted by Japanese shells. The vessel rests in the world's deepest known shipwreck, a fitting testament to the depths of courage displayed by its crew. Naval historians continue to analyze the battle off Samar, seeking rational explanations for the irrational outcome. Some point to Kurita's fatigue after days of continuous operations. Others note the confusion created by American aircraft attacks. Still others credit the smokescreens deployed by the American ships. But those who were there know the truth transcends tactical analysis. The Johnston's charge represented something beyond military calculation, a moment when human determination rewrote the mathematics of combat. The legacy of the Johnston extends beyond military history. Its story exemplifies the potential of human courage to overcome seemingly impossible odds. When a single destroyer charges 4 battleships, the action defies rational analysis. It enters the realm of the mythic, yet it happened. The naval records are clear, the witness accounts consistent. On October 25, 1944, Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans, a Cherokee from Oklahoma, ordered his destroyer to attack the most powerful surface fleet Japan deployed during World War II. The battle's outcome altered the course of the Pacific War. Had Kurita's force broken through to the landing areas at Leyte Gulf, thousands of American soldiers and sailors would have died. The Philippines campaign might have been delayed by months. The war potentially extended. Instead, a handful of small ships fighting against impossible odds turned back a fleet that, by all military calculations, should have annihilated them in minutes. March 2021. United States Naval Academy, Annapolis. Captain Ashley Allison lectures midshipmen on naval tactics and leadership. The battle off Samar defies conventional analysis, she tells the class. By every mathematical measure, Taffy 3 should have been destroyed with minimal impact on the Japanese force. She displays the comparative statistics on the projection screen. Japanese center force: 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, 11 destroyers, total displacement, approximately 205,000 tons, main armament, 18.1-inch, 16-inch, 14-inch, and 8-inch guns, Taffy. 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts, total displacement, approximately 75,000 tons. Main armament, 5-inch guns. The firepower disparity was even more extreme than the tonnage suggests. Allison continues. A single salvo from the Yamato's 9 18.1-inch guns could deliver more destructive power than all of Taffy 3's surface ships combined. A midshipman raises his hand. Then how did they win, ma'am? Allison smiles. That's the question naval theorists have debated for decades, and it's why we still study this battle. Because sometimes the incalculable factors, courage, determination, audacity, override the calculable ones. She changes the slide to show a photograph of Ernest Evans. Evans understood something fundamental about naval warfare. When facing overwhelming odds, conventional tactics ensure conventional outcomes. Only unconventional action creates the possibility of unconventional results. The Johnston story represents more than a tactical anomaly. It demonstrates that warfare, despite increasing mechanization and technological sophistication, remains fundamentally human. Weapons systems, displacement tonnages, and firing solutions matter enormously. But they do not alone determine outcomes. The human element, the willingness to act when action seems futile, to fight when fighting seems hopeless, can overturn the most carefully calculated battle plans. When Ernest Evans turned his destroyer toward Japanese battleships, he changed not just the vector of his vessel, but the entire equation of the battle. His action forced Admiral Kurita to reassess his assumptions. Were these American destroyers the screening force for fast battleships just over the horizon? Was this the prelude to a larger ambush? Uncertainty cascaded through the Japanese command chain. The mathematical certainty of victory became clouded with doubt. The Johnston's final moments remain partially obscured by the fog of war. Survivors reported that as the destroyer lost power and began its final descent, Japanese ships continued to pound it with shells. The vessel, already mortally wounded, absorbed punishment that would have sunk it many times over. As the order to abandon ship was passed, Evans remained on the bridge. His last known words, reported by survivors, were, "Stand by to repel boarders," a defiant joke in the face of annihilation. Of the 327 men aboard the Johnston, 186 died. Many were killed in the initial battle. Others died in the water, waiting for rescue that came too late. For 3 days, survivors floated in shark-infested waters before rescue ships arrived. The price of courage was paid in full measure. The mathematics of naval warfare in 1944 dictated certain truths. Battleships dominated destroyers. Armor defeated shells. Tonnage trumped audacity. Except when it didn't. The Johnston's charge against the Japanese center force represents one of those rare moments when the incalculable overcame the calculable. When human factors, courage, leadership, sacrifice, rewrote the equations of combat. In the decades since, naval tacticians have incorporated these lessons. Modern doctrine recognizes that smaller forces can disrupt larger ones through aggressive action, creating confusion and uncertainty disproportionate to their combat power. But no doctrinal statement can capture the essence of what happened off Samar that October morning. Some actions transcend analysis. They enter the realm of legend not because they defy understanding, but because they define what humans are capable of at their most extraordinary. Ernest Evans received the Medal of Honor posthumously. His citation reads, in part, "The skipper was a fighting man, from the soles of his feet to the top of his head." This simple statement captures something essential about the battle off Samar. When the mathematics of combat dictated retreat, Evans chose to fight. When calculation counseled caution, he chose audacity. When survival instinct urged self-preservation, he chose sacrifice. In doing so, he and his crew aboard the Johnston achieved what military calculations deemed impossible. They turned back a force that, by every measure of naval power, should have annihilated them without slowing its advance. The legacy of their action extends beyond military history. It speaks to the enduring truth that human courage can sometimes defy mathematical certainty. That audacity can sometimes achieve what prudence cannot. That sacrifice can sometimes alter the course of history. The USS Johnston sailed into legend on October 25, 1944. Its story remains a testament to what becomes possible when courage overrides calculation, when duty transcends odds, when the human spirit refuses to be bound by the mathematics of the possible. In the final analysis, perhaps that is why this battle continues to fascinate. It reminds us that even in an age of mechanical warfare, the human element remains decisive, that even against overwhelming firepower, the intangible qualities of leadership and courage can sometimes prevail. The Johnston and Ernest Evans remind us that sometimes, just sometimes, David still beats Goliath.